Welcome to Real Life Fiction Stories, and thank you for joining me. Why don't you come in close? Because tonight, I have a real honest-to-goodness true story that you can look up for yourself. A story about a real house of horrors. A house where an entire family and their maid was murdered. A house where whatever killed them lived in it for days after they were slain. A house that bears a mystery that to this day remains unsolved. The smell of animal waste and hay permeated the night. This would need to be quick and calculated. Eyes peered through the cracks in the side of the barn and followed the 7-year-old girl as she walked in the structure's dwindling shadow, leaving tiny footprints in the pink and orange-hued snow. The sun had all but disappeared behind the trees. Psst, a voice called from the shadows, but the girl knew not to whom it belonged. She stopped and looked around inquisitively. Psst. There it was again. What on earth? The girl thought to herself. It had sounded as though it had been coming from the barn, but nothing in there could have made such a human sound. Perhaps it was her grandfather Andreas calling her over, trying to scare her and tease her again. She would get him this time, and laughed inside with only the tiniest smirk escaping her control. She crouched low to the ground and ducked behind the barn side, believing she was now hidden. But the eyes that had watched her carelessly wander the yard watched her still. Cecilia began to creep toward the barn door, waiting just behind its opening. Psst! She heard it again, and she leaped into the darkness of the barn, hands outstretched, feet apart like the world's smallest sumo wrestler. Boo! She cried aloud, her eyes gleaming with pride, sure she had scared her grandpa before he could scare her. Before her eyes could adjust to the light, something heavy and very hard slammed into Cecilia's chin. A faint crack echoed dully off the barn's wooden paneling as the young girl's jaw gave way, shattered, as she fell on the floor. She couldn't see, and pain filled her head like never before as she scrambled to try and roll over to get up. Her limbs moved like wet noodles, and before she could even sit up, hands wrapped around her mouth and body, pinning her to someone behind her. Her eyes finally began to take in what was around her, and the image of a very sharp blade glinted in the fading light. Just as it came down, with the last of her strength, she struggled to avoid its cold sting. The intent had been to cut the girl's throat, but her sudden movements caused the knife to slash her face several times before finally hitting its target. Her death did not come swiftly, however, and she held her bleeding throat, unable to scream, as she was dragged to the back of the barn to be hidden in the dark and hay, slowly succumbing to death, like a fish caught and placed in the fisherman's sack. It wouldn't be long until someone came looking for her, and those eyes would be ready and waiting. Inside the home, a stone's throw from Cecilia's battered body, her mother Victoria, her grandmother Cecilia Gruber, whom she was named after, and her grandfather Andreas Gruber, prepared for dinner. Her 2-year-old brother Josef lay in his bassinet, cooing and babbling, while the family's new maid, Maria Baumgartner, watched over him as she turned down the beds for Mr. and Mrs. Gruber, and Victoria. When Cecilia failed to come to her mother's calls, she became irritated, and sure she was lollygagging around that barn again. What is my child getting up to now? She huffed to herself. I will be right back as soon as I am done tearing into that girl. She knows better than to run off playing when it's dinner time. Her parents, absorbed in their work, only nodded, her mother adding an almost silent, "Mm-hmm." Victoria stomped up to the barn's entrance, hands on her hips and a look on her face that was sure to strike terror into the face of any child up to no good. Cecilia, you better come here right now, she called into the darkness. Those eyes had been on her since she left the house, and sparkled as they knew it was time again. Psst, from deep back in the barn. Cecilia, you come out here right this instant, or so help me, Victoria trailed off, leaving room for the child's imagination to fill in the blank. Psst, again this time from the dark bowels of the wooden structure. Victoria had had enough, and she marched toward the sound, ready to slap respect into her daughter's ill-mannered mouth. Girl, you bet, she had started to say, her hand raised in the air ready to come down on her daughter, but was cut off by the same heavy blunt object that had destroyed her daughter's jaw, as it plowed into the center of her face. Victoria's body spun around and landed on the floor face down. The heavy object was raised in the air above her unconscious body and came down on the back of her head, ending her life as the skull fractured into bits, but was again and again bludgeoned to be sure. Her body left a trail of black in the darkness that would have been crimson in the light as she was dragged to the back of the barn to join her daughter in the hay.
"Where are those girls? I'm not about to cook for this family all by myself,"
Andreas whined at his wife.
"Mm-hmm,"
Cecilia the elder grunted as she set the table.
"Worthless old woman. I'll get them,"
Andreas grumbled. The eyes watched the elderly man's frame hobble towards the barn, calling his daughter and granddaughter. "Psst," echoed from the darkness once more.
"Victoria?"
her father asked the dark as he stepped inside. Just like his daughter before him, that heavy object smashed into the man's face, tearing his delicate aged skin from his splintered cheekbone, his body convulsing before ceasing into a still heap. Clearly dead, he too was relegated to the back of the barn under the hay. Cecilia the elder sat in the kitchen confused and annoyed. She'd been setting the table for minutes now, and wondered where her family had gone to. Was there something she was missing out on? She lifted her aged but tough-as-nails frame out of her chair and slowly shuffled to the barn to investigate.
"Andreas, Victoria, Cecilia, are you in there?"
"Psst," was the only reply. She stepped into the barn and the object once again came down, striking the old woman in the head. The force had been weaker this time, its weight in the effort to swing it finally biting back at the wielder. Despite a direct blow, the old woman only weaved back and forth in a daze, but had not gone down. A second blow, though just as weak as the first, brought her to her knees, and a third had knocked her flat on her back, her eyes meeting the ones that had been watching her family. There was a clang and thud as the mattock used to slay the old woman's family was dropped by the hands of its wielder, and instead wrapped around Cecilia's throat, choking the remaining life from her. Maria had turned down the beds, changed Joseph, and placed fresh wood on the fire and had sewn a patch onto Mr. Gruber's shirt. She was currently rocking baby Joseph's bassinet trying to soothe his sudden crying, when she noticed how quiet the house had suddenly become. She left Joseph now blurting out only the occasional sob as he began to drift into sleep, and checked the kitchen, where they should have been getting ready to eat. No one was there. She looked outside and only saw footprints leading to the barn. She was about to step outside, but stopped when she noticed footprints leading back to the house. She closed the door again.
"Mr. Gruber?"
she called, but there was no reply. Maria walked the house, finding it empty, and when she went to her room to look out of her window to see if they really were outside, she saw only snow. Joseph had started crying again, something terrible, but as she turned around to go to him, the dull edge of the mattock once more smashed into flesh and bone, and she collapsed on the floor and given one more blow to ensure she was dead. It had been her first day on the job. Footsteps approached the wailing child, and there was a pause before the mattock was brought down on the bassinet and Joseph, again and again, forever silencing his cries. It was April 1st, 1922, and all was silent on the Hinterkaifeck farm in Weidhofen, Bavaria, Germany. It would be 4 days until the bodies would be discovered by the sons of their neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Inspector George Reingruber arrived at the scene to investigate and discovered that after the murders, the killer, or killers, had been living in the home, even feeding and caring for the animals. He also determined that young Cecilia must have been alive for hours before dying, as he had found tufts of her hair in the hay next to her that she had pulled out from distress. The skulls, being the main location of violence, were removed from the bodies and sent to Munich for further examination. The police had initially suspected robbery to be the motive in the murders. However, a large sum of money was found within the home, and the theory was subsequently abandoned. Interviews with locals and neighbors revealed that 6 months prior, Andreas Gruber had found footprints leading to their home, but none that went back out to the forest from where they came. Their long-term maid had suddenly begun to hear footsteps in the attic late at night, and quit when Andreas refused to further acknowledge the occurrences, after he found the attic to be empty. Andreas also had had keys go missing that opened his tool shed, and 1 month before the slayings found a newspaper on their property that did not belong to him or his family, nor was subscribed to by anyone locally. It was also discovered that Andreas had been in an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria. and was the grandfather and father of Josef. Suspects included young Cecilia's father, Victoria's husband Karl Gabriel, who went missing and was presumed dead in World War I, Victoria's lover and neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Adolf and Anton Gump, whose sister swore on her deathbed that her brothers were responsible, as well as a slew of others. In May of that year, a stranger had approached a local of the area, and after asking several questions about the murders, shouted that he had been the killer, before running off into the forest, never to be seen or heard from again. It has also been speculated that a serial killer, who had gone under the radar in the early 1900s, and was supposedly responsible for 40 to 100 murders in the U.S., including the Villisca murders of Lizzie Borden fame, named Paul Mueller, had been responsible. However, to date, the identity of the killer or killers have not been confirmed. Shortly after the investigation, the farm was demolished, and in its place was erected a monument to the family. The bodies of the victims were laid to rest without their heads in Weidhofen Cemetery. The skulls had been kept in Munich safely until World War II, when they were lost. Theories continue to abound about who could have killed the family that fateful night. In truth, we may never know. Just remember, lock your house, and if your keys go missing, change the locks.